Hello and welcome to the Mamamade podcast. I'm your host, Sophie Barron, and today I am joined by Stacey Zimmels. You probably know her on Instagram as Feed Eat Speak, the expert lactation consultant and feeding expert. Now, let me just say before we jump in that this episode is so informative. It is like a weaning workshop in your ear. So if you're just getting started or you're thinking about getting started, this is definitely the episode for you. Feel free to pause it, to jump around, to take notes. It's really that meaty. So I hope you guys enjoy. Of course, as always, please do let us know by getting in touch with us either on Instagram or over email, and we will answer all questions. I hope you guys love this episode as much as I did recording it. Firstly, a huge thank you to today's guest, Stacey Zimmels. She is the brains, the heart, the soul behind Feed Eat Speak on Instagram, feeding and speech therapist. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me and for that lovely introduction.
So first, for anybody who doesn't follow you or doesn't know you, perhaps you could just give us a bit more about yourself and what brought you to start this community that you've built on Instagram, which is now 74,000 parents and counting.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, you've sort of said my credentials. So I've worked for many years in the NHS, supporting parents, families, children, babies with feeding difficulties as a feeding specialist speech therapist. And then I had my own kids and actually found all the sort of online information about feeding and about sleep, but more about feeding, just super conflicting, really inaccurate, bit of a minefield. And I know that when I was sort of with my friends as well, who had just had babies, they didn't initially know what I did for a living and they weren't able to get answers to were really basic. So I just started like messing around and having my own account with my second child and just sharing bits about my journey with him and then making that information sort of factual and evidence-based. It sort of took off from there. I think in the COVID, when the pandemic started, I think more so then people were just really struggling to access any face-to-face support, particularly around lactation and breastfeeding. And I think that's when my account came into its own because I was able to post regularly and share information that people needed.
Amazing. And it's just, there are no words really for how helpful you are to so many people. As you say, the resources are all over the place. They're often conflicting. And sometimes you just want someone that you really trust to tell you like it is. And so today we're focusing really on weaning and kind of what it is and what it means and on different feeding difficulties and things to bear in mind. So we'll be going through really a lot of the basics, and then hopefully we can, tap into a lot of your expertise around when parents should worry or things, because I know it's a very worrying time for so many parents. So I suppose the first, I guess, is how do we know kind of when to start with weaning, what to look for, and what kind of basics to have covered for parents before they really start dipping into it?
Sure. So when I do weaning webinars and I talk to families about weaning, I sort of start by saying that sort of first off, around the 6-month mark is when your little one showing their readiness cues. Now, for some infants, it might be a little bit before 6 months, and for some, it may be more towards 6.5 or a little bit longer. There are lots of myths associated with starting solids. So some big ones are sleep hitting the skids, therefore they must be hungry. Babies, putting lots and lots of things in their mouths, babies staring at you eating. And none of these things are proven or shown to be reliable as weaning readiness cues. The few things that are important and that you should look for is your baby's physical capability, particularly for sitting, holding their head upright. Ideally for finger foods, they should be completely independent at sitting. Whereas for spoon feeding, as long as they can sit upright in a high chair with a bit of support and hold their head upright, they're good to go. The next thing is sort of hand-to-eye coordination and an interest in reaching out, picking up food and lifting and taking it to their mouth. And then finally, you could be looking at your baby's physical skills around eating. And there's a reflex called the tongue thrust or the tongue protrusion reflex, which is basically like a sucky motion where they suck and push out their tongue out of their mouth forward and backwards. Now, this doesn't switch off overnight. It gradually diminishes over time, but most babies will start to have this diminish around 6 months. And what you're going for is that when you give them solids, they swallow more than they push out. So you may notice occasionally they sort of push a little bit out with their tongue. But if the majority of things are going down, if actually you are noticing that you put it in, it comes out, if you put it in, they come out, just stop and wait another week or two, because they might just not be ready.
So that was my question, is because I'm sure you experience this as well. Like, most parents I speak to don't actually wait, let's say, until that 6-month mark. Most parents say, oh, she was ready, he was ready, I just felt right. And is that fine? Or what might be the drawbacks to not waiting until 6 months? How do you sort of manage that with parents when they say that they felt like their baby was ready, even if they're not necessarily just demonstrating these 3 signs together?
Well, it's really difficult because as parents, we are really the experts in our own children. What I hear a lot is parents being told to wean by either well-meaning healthcare professionals, friends and family, to sort of often fix something else like growth, or worries about, or breastfeeding's not brilliant, or they don't love their bottles, or and so they get sort of suggested, we'll start solids like it's a fix all. And so the most common thing I come across is this combination of things where solids is started early before the baby's ready, and so also started in a pressure cooker situation, with the goal being that if you do the solids, it's going to fix something else. And those two things together make for a really stressful, often feeding experience and weaning experience at the beginning, because what you have is a baby that might not be ready. And if a baby's not ready, they won't be able to eat or interact with food in the same way as a baby that's like, developmentally there. And if they don't, then that makes it harder for the baby, and it makes it harder for the parents in terms of their expectations. And then you get the second part, which is, I need you to eat because my mother-in-law told me if you eat, then you'll sleep. So actually, your cues are saying, I can't do this, but my mother-in-law is saying, make it happen because you're exhausted and go to sleep. And I say it jokingly, but various scenarios like this, they'll grow more, or various other things. And so whether it's just one part or both parts, my experience then is that weaning doesn't get off to the best start for either the parents or for the baby, and it's super stressful.
That really resonates in terms of like just feeling so much pressure from other people around you when it comes, especially when it's your first child. Obviously everybody has an opinion, and you have often, if it's your first child, you don't really know what to do, so you're looking to other people for advice. We've done some work on Mamamade on boundary setting, and I think really the best way to set boundaries like that is to just arm yourself with this knowledge. So having you today, Stacey, to really talk us through what to look out for, that's the best way to kind of stand up, let's say, to pushy in-laws or parents who might make you feel like you don't know your baby best or don't know what to do best.
And if it makes anybody listening feel better if they've been in that situation, I was in that situation, and I definitely started solids with my daughter before she was ready, and before 6 months, because she didn't sleep. She woke up every 45 minutes, and I knew that starting solids would not make it any better, but I did not have anything else in my armory that would. And I was hearing these messages multiple times from multiple people. And when I say I started early, it was a week or so before she was 6 months, and she was almost ready, and we still had a really positive experience. But with my second, I did it completely differently. And in fact, everyone was like, is he not eating yet? And I was like, yeah, he can wait another week or two. He's fine. Look at him. He likes his milk. So I almost went the other way, and I was like, okay, I really need to start now.
I think that brings us to really kind of carrying on from that point about parents and maybe outsiders who have an opinion. It brings us to this kind of artificial debate that's come up around weaning of kind of baby-led versus purees. Baby-led obviously being when you never spoon feed your child, you just go straight into finger foods on the tray. Purees being perhaps the more traditional route that our parents and grandparents would have done, presumably because weaning was probably suggested to start a bit younger. In my experience, I've sort of done both with my kids. It's a debate that sort of looms large in a lot of people's minds of what should I do? How do I do it? Or I know I want to do baby led, or I know I want to do spoon feeding. How do you sort of explain it to parents in your weaning workshops?
Sure. So, I mean, the way that I explain it is that ultimately, it's your choice, and you need to pick a method that feels right for you, that sits with how you cook, or that sits with how you feed your baby already, or just, that you're getting a feeling like this works best for me. So, for example, if you're worried about gagging and choking, often parents will choose to predominantly spoon feed and then introduce solids when the baby's sort of got a bit more used to it. There's no right or wrong way. They're just different ways. And ultimately, the end point at sort of 1 year, which is sort of the end of the weaning process, should be that your baby can eat a range of adult foods that are just chopped to a size that's manageable for them. And so the journey, the process, is sort of not that significant in the scheme of things. There are things we know that stand babies in good stead for later positive eating habits, but that's not been shown to be whether they're baby led weaned versus whether they're spoon fed. As long as you're responsive with how you feed them, i.e. you follow their cues. If you are spoon feeding them, you're mindful of watching if they've had enough and not being driven by the volumes you want them to eat, then it all should come out in the wash, and you get to the same end point. And bearing in mind also, there is a middle ground where you can introduce foods on a spoon and also give your baby opportunity to have finger foods that they pick up themselves from a tray. And that's not spoon feeding and baby led weaning per se. It's a combination of spoon feeding and finger foods. Baby led weaning is super purist in its approach, which is very much that you do not give your baby anything, and everything they do is led by them. So for those people that choose to follow that method, it's not quite the same as sort of finger foods per se. So yeah, that's sort of the difference between them. And if you want me to, I can explain, I guess, some of the positives of both, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it'd be super helpful, because I'm just like, something that you've just said that's really sort of stuck in my mind is that feeding responsively. I know that's something that I learned from your page about breastfeeding. For example, I was put under so much pressure with Liba to put on a schedule that breastfeeding we never really got on with it. I mean, I did sort of muscle my way through, but it wasn't a positive experience at all. And then having that in the back of my mind for Arthur's breastfeeding journey just made the whole thing a joy. And to have that sort of same frame of mind when it comes to solids, I think it takes a lot of the pressure off in a way, because you are just sort of responding to what your baby needs rather than trying to get them to fit into something that isn't natural to them, or perhaps. But yeah, I mean, for parents who are still sort of weighing up what should the first sort of action be that they do when they start weaning, perhaps you could speak through the kind of benefits of the two.
Yeah, sure. So if we start with spoon feeding, that is probably a more natural progression in some ways from suck feeding to solids, because the first foods we give are foods that can be taken from the spoon using not dissimilar movements of the tongue forward and backwards. And bearing in mind that you learn to eat from a combination of experience and your body's physical development at certain stages. And so what sort of pure traditional spoon feeding approach does is that it works with your baby. So as your baby is developing new skills, so separation of movement, more lateralization of the tongue, more rotational jaw, you're making the textures more challenging and you're meeting them in the middle. That's how that approach works. And so it can be helpful if, for example, your baby is more prone to gagging, if you're worried about choking, if you are wanting them to sort of be eating from day one. There's a reason, for example, that you want them to eat. Perhaps you're going back to work quite soon, you're breastfeeding, they don't take a bottle, you'd like them to be established on foods and not still sort of squishing things up in their hands. So those babies tend to eat more sooner. When it comes to baby-led weaning, though, we need to remember that, before manufactured baby products and foods and, stage 1 foods and stage 9 months old with lumps and bumps in it, actually all we had was the pure versions of the food, and we just had to manipulate them in whatever way to make it easy for baby. And so they're more than capable to pick up take them to the mouth and, start to use their emerging oromotor skills to do their best to manage them easier with softer foods. And I'm very much in, making sure that they're presented in a way that they can pick them up with their hands, take them to their mouth and manage them once they get there. Babies that are baby-led weaned in a very pure way, i.e. nothing else, and left to it, tend to have a slower start because it takes them a while to figure things out. They tend to be on breast milk for that bit longer before they're really eating more foods, but it's still really variable. They tend to have probably more advanced sort of pincer grip or hand-to-eye coordination. But once you start finger foods with a spoon-fed baby, then again, that all catches up with each other. So a lot of it's really down to preference.
That's a really, I think, important point for people to bear in mind is, like, as you say, it sort of all comes out in the wash. At the end of the day, if you're sort of remaining calm and persistent and offering variety of foods and nurturing along with the texture challenge, then actually the goal is the same and the outcome is eventually the same as well.
Exactly. And you just mentioned it. So offering a variety and following your baby's lead, regardless of what approach you take, and being responsive are really the super important things around weaning. And there's so many different approaches, offering vegetables first, offering baby rice, which, it's like a minefield. And I think that they're the key things, and role modeling, eating with your baby, offering a variety, and following their lead. And with the best will in the world, there'll be mums and dads who choose to spoon feed their infants and they won't open their mouth for a spoon and you have to go down the finger food route. So, tell you how they need to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, though, about the kind of baby setting the stage and baby setting the route. And you're, of course, an expert in feeding difficulties, and you see families when perhaps things aren't going as expected. And you've mentioned, of course, the commercial baby foods and how they have these labels about stages, and they've corresponded to ages. And there's a lot of talk about why that's really problematic. When should, let's say, a parent worry that their child isn't self-feeding or if their child isn't comfortable with a lot of texture? Obviously, you've mentioned like continually challenging, but when would you suggest parents actually pick up the phone and call you for a consultation?
I mean, it's really difficult because it's quite individual, isn't it? I always say to families, and I often do myself out of business, if your baby's progressing, albeit at a slower rate, that's always a great sign. It's when the baby is stuck and therefore you're stuck, that's a red flag and an alarm bell. If, I think we've talked before and you've mentioned your son, Arthur, perhaps sort of taking his own sweet time, progressing and moving. But, you didn't call for help. And I guess, I'll ask you, what made you know that it was all right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've talked about it quite a bit, actually. I think because Liba was actually just so quick to get her head around it. And, my parents still make fun that we went on holiday when she was 9 months old and she was basically eating like a whole falafel sandwich. She was totally cool about most textures. And so by contrast, I saw Arthur, who, I just wasn't bothered by it, was in no rush, which is sort of his nature. I mean, he was like a full 2 weeks late to come earthside. Why did I not call anyone? I think I saw that, as you say, he was progressing. Like, he did show his interest. It just, he couldn't sit for more than 5 to 6 minutes in the high chair. But when he was in the high chair, he was happy. He was never but he had his limit. So I think it was more like, I did see that he was getting it. It was just quite slow. And he wasn't refusing the spoon, but he just wasn't taking loads. He just wasn't interested in eating it as a meal. I mean, he was still relying heavily on his milk. And it was really, we turned a corner where he was really, his solids were outpacing the milk probably around 10 months. So I guess, as you say, like, I just saw progress, so I wasn't too worried about it.
So I do think that's really important that you're seeing progress. And I think the other thing is, understanding what's normal and then when it stops being normal. And there's no exact point, like put me in your phone to call at 8 months or 9 months but I think it's when it feels for you that it's coming outside the realms of what you might have expected. So for example, I see lots of little ones with gagging when they're eating. Now at 6 months, if anyone calls me to say their kid's still gagging, I'll suggest that they just crack on and see where they are in a month from now. At 7 months, if they're still gagging as much as they were at 6 months, you could continue continue to progress, but keep a really close eye on it. And at 8 months, if they're still gagging the same as 6 months, then you probably need to go and see somebody. Whereas actually, if that gagging has reduced and they're progressing and you feel like you've managed to move them from one texture to another, then perhaps you don't. Or if you're somewhere in the middle and actually they're gagging but less, but you can't, you still can't give them finger foods, or you still can't give them thicker purees at 8 months, then again, it's worth going and speaking to your GP, seeing if they can refer you to a feeding and swallowing specialist, speech therapist, or looking at private consultation if that's something that you're in a position to do, to find out what or why they are gagging. And it's usually gagging in the early months that's the first sign of any oromotor or a sensory issues, in my experience. Like that will probably be the first hurdle. We also see lots of babies that just don't want to eat, that they're happy to go to the table but they don't eat much. And again, the boundary for that is so individual. I see some families at 10 months when that's going on, but many when the baby's over 1, and they're still not really eating. So again, it's quite personal.
And I guess it should be said that medical professionals and healthcare professionals like yourselves, you probably want to see families when they're worried and turn them away rather than leave something lingering. So I guess that's my opportunity to just jump in and say, if you are worried about it, why not seek help? There's so many amazing free resources through your GP or health visitor to at least get an initial consultation. Going back to that concept of feeding responsibly and watching the progress, a lot of questions that we get are around kind of how much or portion sizes. So what is your view on that? Is there a concern around how much a baby should be eating, or when do we start worrying about portion sizes?
So never really, as long as your baby's growing. Honestly, that's, I've got, this sounds mad. I've got a lovely lady who's just started helping me after school. And for the first time yesterday, I'd asked her to give the kids some food, and it was pizza actually. And she came to find me. I was working, and she came to find me to say, for my son Gaby, when should I stop him? Like how much can he eat? And I was like, oh, he'll eat a whole adult pizza. And she was like, is that okay? And I was like, yeah, that's fine. And it's really interesting, like how different people come at things from different perspectives. And so it's fine if they want to eat a whole adult pizza at the age of 4. And the same kid, the day before, I'd made meatballs, mashed potato. He had some red cabbage. He had some kale on his plate. And effectively, he ate like 2 meatballs and didn't touch anything else on the plate. And the same kid was done. He had a banana for dessert, and that's what he had for dinner the night before. Now, he's a healthy child, and he's learned from day one that, no one's going to make you eat any more than you want to eat. And that's the key thing when it comes to weaning. So there aren't any portion sizes for weaning children. And actually, my colleague on Instagram, SR Nutrition, has got a really great post on this. It's an image of a plate, and it says what a 9-month-old eats. And it's got 4 different pictures of the same meal with like different amounts of food on it, just to illustrate that at 9 months, 4 different babies could eat 4 completely different volumes. And it's also important to think about, their intake over the day and how the milk is impacting on what they're eating. So again, when it comes to portion sizes, it's really, are they eating something? Are they eating a variety? Have they got a balanced plate of food? Is it nutritious? Rather than how much they eat. And when you're spoon feeding them, it's just also learning their cues. So you spoke about Arthur, being done in his high chair 5-6 minutes. And the best thing you did was to be responsive to that. And now he's older and he'll sit longer and he'll eat more, right? So it's not worth the battles because they figure it out. Or sometimes you need to give them a nudge if, the milk's playing, if they're on formula and the milk's, playing a bit too much of a part as they get much older. But yeah, just follow their lead.
I definitely have found that when I started introducing solids to Liba, it was like, oh my gosh, I can correct my own relationship with food. Like all the things that I had learned about, you know, I definitely grew up in a household where we had to finish our plates. We were put, so much pressure was put on us to eat what was put in front of us. I remember absolute battles between like my sister and my parents over what she was eating. And I think it's quite liberating actually to remind ourselves that it's actually better for the babies just to feed them responsibly. Again, I know I said that earlier on in this episode about the milk feeds, and it definitely follows on for solids, is kind of eliminating that pressure makes it so much more positive for everybody. And knowing that it's sort of building a healthier relationship as well, only a good thing.
Absolutely. And actually, I would say that for some of the clients that I see, a lot of the challenges are around parental expectations, either with portion sizes or, I did a story the other day about the leftover porridge in my kids' bowls. So, you could look at this in two completely different ways. You could either say, gosh, they mustn't have eaten much breakfast at all. Or you could look at it to say, actually, if you'd have known how full the bowl was and how completely huge the portion sizes my husband served up, that actually they'd both eaten enough. And actually, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much they ate because they were done when they were done. So the parental expectations, and then often we're driven by our expectations, which stop us being as responsive as we might like to be, and therefore creates a much more stressful environment. Often for us, the babies are sometimes nonplussed by it, but it's us just like, oh, they haven't eaten enough. Should I give them another snack? Will they have their nap? Okay, then maybe they haven't had that. Then they're not going to have their nap because they didn't eat so much. I'll give them some extra milk. So you give them some extra milk and then they don't eat at lunchtime, and you get into like spirals, don't you, of like, but if you'd have just gone, okay, at breakfast, and been okay with saying, okay, and then just like let the day pan out, they'd have probably had a bigger lunch. So I think we're sometimes guilty of like sabotaging ourselves, overthinking a bit.
100%. No, completely. It's definitely like I've had so many times where I've had to check myself and be like, but she's full. Why am I making a big fuss over how much she ate? As you say, yeah, you can look at the plate of leftovers in several ways and challenge my own kind of hookups or hangups about about how we feed. I've just been nodding along ferociously. And then in terms of parent expectations, we definitely hear a lot, parents want their kids to eat really healthy. They want them to love all of their veg and all of their healthy foods. And so people do get quite hung up or worried about what should the first food be. And we've talked a bit in this episode already about, it's about variety, it's about persistence, it's about regularly exposing, but what foods do you typically suggest, or what first foods did your kids have?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think both of mine started with avocado, I think as a finger food, and banana. So I definitely didn't do the sort of every day a veggie sort of for the beginning. I did mostly, I did baby-led weaning with Gaby. With Anna L, I did some spoon feeding, but I wasn't sort of that hung up with either of them about like not having a spoon. My husband is French. He was like, what is this nonsense? Here, eat this, child, So, we have to work with, what we've got in our home. And, like I said, I'm quite relaxed. So yeah, it was avocado, I think, and banana. There is some research that suggests that if you expose to vegetables first, it can help develop their preferences for vegetables, particularly the bitter ones. That is also linked with continued exposure. But I'm super pragmatic, and one of the things that like I don't want parents to do is feel super pressured about having to give vegetables only, or because, and I've heard I've heard parents say, well, my kid's really fussy, it's because I didn't do baby-led weaning, or my kid's really fussy, it's because I didn't do vegetable every day for 2 weeks. And it's important to recognize that fussy eating is a super common phenomenon for lots of babies, and B, that there's other factors that play a part in it, like genetics, like parenting, as well as things like early exposure. And it's not that if you give vegetables regularly early on, they won't be fussy eaters. It's just that it is associated with more acceptance of vegetables. But you also need to continue to give them. And I know for me, and both my kids are a bit fussy, or quite fussy, and vegetables are not their favorite foods. I went back to work at 12 months and I really like dialed down on the vegetables, and it's bitten me in the bum twice because, just giving them less, or, defaulting to same foods because it was easier. And those things contribute. So I guess what I want the message to be for parents is, again, this is what we know. Choose what works for you. Variety is super important, but first foods, yeah, if you want to give vegetables every day, it may help with their acceptance longer term, but that still needs to be continued. And there are so many factors at play. I think there's a lot of pressure and lots of messages saying this way is the right way. And I don't know, I think we have to be pragmatic.
No, I completely agree. Like I didn't start either of my children on kale or spinach, but they are foods that they will accept sometimes, not every time, sometimes. But it depends on their mood. It depends on what the dish is. It depends, on what they've eaten otherwise in the day.
Sure.
And I think it's just bearing in mind that these are still humans, they've got hungrier days, they've got less hungrier days, and they're their own people with their own makeup. So just feeding them kale and spinach for the first 2 weeks isn't going to turn them into a child that doesn't want sugar when they're 3 or 4.
Sure, exactly. My daughter ate avocado a lot, broccoli a lot as an infant, and they're two foods that she really won't entertain now. And she didn't eat kale and spinach as an infant, but we eat them quite a lot at home now, and she will eat them sometimes. So it's like you say, you can't sort of pinpoint these things exactly. But overall, when it comes to veggies, the message is, early introduction, lots of repetition may mean that they are more accepting, of veggies long term.
And I guess it's like that repeated exposure. It's not giving up on that first time when they see a piece of avocado and perhaps they just pick it up and throw it. It's about continually reintroducing that food.
Yeah, and being a stable part of what you're exposing them to through toddlerhood.
Thank you. And then just a bit about any foods to avoid, things to look out for when it comes to labels, anything along that line that you like, just as a parent, also not just a feeding expert, but how you like to look at labels and things like that.
Sure. So, I mean, I have to say that as a parent in my kids' first year, mostly I was making food from scratch. And then I was being like, oh, I mean, we didn't have Mamamade then. And then, although I love your pancakes, by the way. Just as an adult, I know, I think the texture's amazing. I've had a little play with them. The texture's amazing for first self-feeding foods. Anyway, that's an aside. I'm a bit of a fan. But it's being mindful of things like bread and cheese, which have got things like salt in them, and again, not getting super hung up on it if you're giving predominantly home cooked foods, but being aware that they're both food safe, for example, that have got added salt content. So, be mindful that you don't give both of those foods every day, 3 times a day, because it will add up. And then obviously the NHS website has got guidance on foods that we should avoid in weaning. So yeah, we talked about salt, certain fishes, shellfish, honey, etc. So be aware of what they are. You can find it online. And then the other things really are, for me anyway, are choking risks. So foods that could increase the risk of your child choking. So that might be like hard nuts, round or oval shaped foods like cherry tomatoes, blueberries, and grapes that are whole, and knowing how to knowing to avoid them or how to provide them in a different way. So ground nuts, nut butters, puffs, there's some puff snacks with peanuts in, for example, and then cutting lengthways, long sort of round foods, cutting them lengthways, and again, there's lots of information out there about how to do that. So that's sort of my overall take on avoidance.
That's so helpful, Stacey. Thank you. I think my takeaway from this chat is really just there's a lot of exploration that's required. There's a lot of patience from the parent. It's really about responding to the baby. And at the end of the day, there is sort of no right or wrong. It's kind of there's guidelines in place, but ultimately no baby is going to be the same, even 2 babies in the same family. I think that's really helpful to sort of take any pressure off of parents. There's really no right or wrong way within reason, I guess.
Yeah, within reason, absolutely. I think that's it. And in the minefield of you should do this, baby-led wean and vegetables first and fruits first and pouches are bad. And, in all of this stuff, it's just sort of working out what fits your family, what fits your lifestyle, and knowing like what your sort of when it comes to, say, food choices, for example, what your healthiest options are, and then taking a really pragmatic view that fits with you and putting your baby center in that.
A great note to end on. Thank you, Stacey. I really appreciate you joining us today, teaching us all about the basics of weaning and thoughts. For anybody who doesn't follow Stacey at Feed, Eat, Speak, her platform is just an amazing wealth of resources. I can say firsthand, it made my second time around breastfeeding, I was so much more confident. It was such a positive experience thanks to everything I learned from Stacey. And you run webinars and more focused workshops as well for people who are looking for more detail on any topic. Thank you so much again. I just really appreciate you spending a bit of your day with us. So thank you, Stacey.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you guys agree that was a lot and it's so helpful. Usually Stacey charges for her weaning workshop, so you guys got to save this down and share it. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be back with even more episodes, more advice, more guests. It's going to be a lot of fun. So send us all your questions, share all your weaning wins. Follow us at Hello Mamamade. You can follow me at Sophie M. Barron. And of course, you can follow Stacey, if you're not already, at Feed, Eat, Speak. Just remember that we're always here with you throughout this journey to share the load and share the love.